probably we'll begin the discussion without the main speaker. Would anybody like to begin, just probably basing on our last seminar, the problems we discussed then, and when Jacques joins us, of course, we'll give the floor to him. You know, in that article by Jamie, he sent us, and which we placed on our website, some of the ideas he expressed in his speech. You know, they are put more in detail. And it's interesting that there he is speaking that in the short run, one shouldn't pay attention to financial stability, that everything which is needed should be financed, irrespective of whether the country has this finance or should print money or something like that. But then he says that after all, when all this is over, when the pandemic is over and an economy faces the problem of returning to normal, then of course the reckoning will take place, and it is inevitable, and a lot of debts would be accumulated by then, and also he believes that the aftermath will be, we all will face very complex problems, and we should be ready for that, of course. And he also expresses an idea that probably those problems will be so significant, so big, that they would lead to some quite radical changes in the economic system. At least he is in favor of some quite radical changes as a result of this crisis, which was produced because of the pandemic. So this is one of the ideas which seem to me quite interesting and deserving discussion. Probably somebody would like to say a few words on this, or probably some other problems. You know, we all feel that the situation, you know, develops in quite an unfavorable direction in economic sphere. Now practically the oil market has collapsed, and a lot of supply side shocks as well as demand shocks, and those shocks are interconnected with each other. We face them, and quite a lot of researchers who study this situation, they're quite skeptical and comparing this crisis and estimating. Jacques, are you here? I don't see Jacques.
什么
Was it Jacques or somebody else?
跟我看什么好啊
Looks like it's somebody from China.
No. So quite a lot of researchers believe that this crisis may be compared only to Great Depression in the last century, and believe that this crisis is going to be much more serious than the world financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, 9. So, what do you think about the development of economic crisis and also the way out of it when pandemic is over? Does anybody have any ideas?
Alexander, I'm not the
Please.
economist in your midst, but I wonder about the political consequences, because it's one thing to say right now, as Jamie Galbraith said last week, yes, pay for everything now, but at some point it has to be paid back, and people have to make sacrifices to make the situation pay backable. And how is that going to work politically? At the moment, everyone says, yes, we all want to get healthy, stay healthy, we want to defeat the virus. But when it comes to allocating the burdens of carrying that later on, it's going to be difficult. And internationally, it's not clear where the leadership is going to come from to provide for an international, cooperative, coordinated response to these difficult issues. I'm very struck in this situation compared with the financial crisis in 2008. For better or for worse, people looked to the United States government and the G20 and so on to provide coordinated response. But today, well, there's nothing there. It's a void. It's a vacuum. So what's going to happen there? I don't know.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, thank you.
This is the view from Geneva. And what is the view from London, Jan? Or Sweden?
Well, well, London is pretty difficult at the moment. Sweden, Jamie discussed it last week, and I think he discussed many things very well. I was impressed at the detail with which he understood the Swedish situation. But a week on, yes, it's the Swedish response has been not to restrict economic activity quite as much. So the bars are open, the restaurants are open, the fitness centers are open, and so on. But what Jamie also said last week, it's quite a specific context in Sweden. Things like the deep trust that people have in the state. So when the state comes with guidelines, you don't need police to enforce it, and people follow quite, and there are no protests on the street, a la Michigan and Virginia. And on top of that, yeah, Swedes, 50% of Swedes live by themselves, so they don't share their homes. And if any of you know Swedes terribly much, they're quite reserved people. They don't touch each other in normal times. So there are lots of reasons why I think the Swedish case is quite specific. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't recommend the approach in Russia.
Okay, can I tell several words?
Oh yes, please, Sergey.
Yes. Really, in Russia, we are more discussing how to survive in this situation and how to support the business. But we are really only emerging markets company and not in the advanced economy. So we have no enough resources and finance resources also to support in the way as it is done in United States or in European Union. And so it's time even in Russian economy to think about the exit strategy, how to support our economic life after, in some regions, the normalization will come rather soon. Maybe nowadays in Moscow and Moscow region and the middle and heart of our country, it's the most difficult situation exists. But rather soon, I'm sure, it will move to the eastern part of the country, and in some million inhabitants cities in the eastern part in Siberia will meet the same problems without real medical resources, without certainly less resources than in Moscow. And what to do in such a situation? Certainly we can start with the exit from epidemic to the normalization in economy, starting in Moscow and St. Petersburg. I'm not a biologic specialist, but I think it will take about 2 months more when we can open some and stop the low down of this quarantine in our self-isolation in our terminology. But in all countries, it will take more time. And when the movement between the regions and then the movement across the borders, for example, with the EU countries, we can return back to the normal life. It's absolutely non-predictable nowadays. So I think that we need some international coordination, maybe on the platform, not only the G20, but in some special organization, United Nations organization or something like that, to discuss this all the road map for reviving the economic life. Certainly, it's not only the human capital movement, but first of all, the movement of all other resources. But without the labor force, it's impossible to support any economic recovery. It's a lot of problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Yes, the situation really is difficult, complex situation. Jacques Sapir is trying to join us. Yes, and so the problem of international cooperation also is a very tricky one. Even within the CE, as we know, there are a lot of problems here. As far as many researchers see, there is quite a significant setback when all the countries have chosen to close the frontiers, not to cooperate with each other actively. Now it seems that the situation is being changed somewhat, but a lot of problems emerged here. And I am afraid that it's very difficult to give good advices here. Are you here? Jacques? Jacques is here, but he doesn't, there is no sound. I don't know why. Okay, let's continue our discussion. Yes, Mikhail Zhernov. And please present yourself so that...
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure if you read me. Do you read
Yes.
me?
Yes,
Oh,
loud and clear.
Great, thank you. I'm calling you from London. That's true. Well, it's been just mentioned as a difficult place. It's probably true in many respects, but I think it would be only natural to convey to you some recent developments here. It is true the UK is facing its fifth week in lockdown. The situation still remains very difficult in many respects. It's been decided already that the lockdown will not be lifted for another 3 weeks. The pandemic is continuing to expand. The number of infected has reached 125,000 people. The latest death toll exceeds 16,000 people already. The daily increasing number of deaths seems to be slightly lowering down. However, this trend should not be interpreted with a great caution because of statistical nuances. You said twist with the pandemic, with pandemic is related to the situation with the care homes, which have been left absolutely unprepared for the spread of the virus. The number of infected here is rising rapidly over the last 2 or 3 weeks. The dramatic situation with vital civil supplies has been sorted out in a very efficient way by the government practically in 2-3 days after the beginning of lockdown. However, essential medical supplies, so-called personal protection equipment, still remains a very serious problem. The medical staff here is doing a really great job, sometimes making really heroic efforts. Every Thursday at 8 o'clock, the whole country comes out from their homes and clapping in appreciation and respect to the medical staff. The government was widely criticized for being rather slow in taking lockdown measures. However, it's been really fast and efficient with the program of support to the business. The overall value of this program of support is somewhere around 350 billion pounds, which amounts to almost 15% of the country's GDP. The program includes basically the same forms of support as those taken in many other countries, including Russia. Among them, retention scheme, which is supposed to ensure at least 80% of the wages of the employees. Self-employed income support scheme, the benchmark is the same here, is also 80%. Extra support to the unemployed through so-called universal credit. And well, apart from that, somewhere around 1 billion additional support for renters, with 3 months no eviction clause and 3 months of mortgage holidays. Well, some measures which have been taken already could be regarded as a survival package, but some are more proactive nature, aiming at recovery or probably to the next stage, which we regard as an exit strategy. What really looks really important in this is that the business here can expect very substantial direct financial injections in the form of loans and guarantees, which in total amount to 330 billion pounds. Another 30 billion will be given to business throughout tax relief and grants. What seems really important here, again, and I'd like to emphasize the direct financial injection. That's exactly what the economy really needs now. Not only tax reliefs, but as I said, direct financial support. Of course, there's no doubt that the main piece of this cake will be given to the biggest corporations like, well, say, British Airways, which allegedly may get around £20 billion of the government support. So the big boys have enough political connections and experience to negotiate such kind of deals with the government and with the banks. And totally different matter is small and medium business. The banks nowadays receive daily a huge number of applications for support, which they are supposed to process within 6 working days. However, in spite of simplified procedures, the banks often cannot cope with this flow of applications. So even in the case of very substantial resources provided by the government, conservative internal procedures may become a real bottleneck in this cash flow. Another challenge, as it is seen now, is the banking regulations. The steep increase in the amount of loans may result in substantial deterioration of the bank's portfolio. So the central bank needs to be prepared for such development. There's a lot of talk about what can be expected. Regardless of how quick the transition to recovery stage may be achieved, it's clear that the depth of crisis is absolutely unprecedented in the modern history. Recently, I ran into assessment in the press that the national economy shrank almost 30% in the first quarter of this year. Speaking of long-term consequences of this virus-related crisis, very often rather gloomy assessments have been heard. It is not easy to predict the future, but what seems highly probable is the following. A very rapid growth of public and corporate debt, which in case of UK may accelerate first steps of nationalization of certain infrastructure industries, like say railways. We can expect default cascade because of non-payment chain reaction. While the crisis may also result in the further growth of the biggest corporations, which may get interested in selling part of their stakes to the government as a price for the financial support. Well, say a rather lengthy experience of working from home can lead to radical reorganization of many businesses, to very serious changes in the commercial real estate market. Apparently, we can expect a rapid advance in IT corporations, online retailers, etc. Well, and hopefully there will be no austerity policy anymore from the Tory government with regard to the national health system. When it comes to international relations, the most probable result, at least, well, it is almost common point of view, there will be a very serious strengthening of the role of China in the world economy. China is considered now the only possible winner of this crisis. Many expect China may take a very aggressive investment assault overseas, given the current market turmoil in the Western countries. And one more, from my point of view, very interesting number. The World Trade Organization expects global merchandise trade to shrink by almost 30% in the short run. If this trend prevails for longer term, it may become very serious correlation to any kind of globalization or any current trends in the world economy. Well, thank you. Sorry for taking so much of your time.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mikhail. So, Yes, Borя, would you like to say
Yeah,
something?
yeah.
It's Porfiriev, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Alexandrovich. So I would like to pick up on your point on comparison between Great Depression and current crisis on the one hand, and the remarks on resource deficiency, which was raised by Sergei Konstantinovich. So from my point of view, the comparison is quite correct. But if we really try to put these things in comparative perspective, we would see that current crisis involves much more uncertainty, much more uncertainty. We have this Great Depression, we have the plummeting economy for several years, we have the shrinkage of the GDP, but we know the causes. We knew the causes. We knew the culprits, so we could respond adequately in that. But currently, we have these pandemics. We have this coronavirus, which behavior is described as very, very unprecedented and unpredictable. So we don't know our future. We don't know the really causes, what would happen, even in the next few months, actually. We believe that we would reach this plateau, but nobody knows exactly. And that involves uncertainty, and that involves uncertainty in investments. So I would like to stress that from my perspective, from my point of view, the point of the problem of resources is, well, number two, but priority number one is uncertainty. We don't know how to spend these resources. We have these resources. We know, as far as our country is concerned, we have these reserves of the central bank. We have this resources in foreign currency. We have other resources. So they're quite enough. But the problem is we don't know how to spend them better. This on the one hand. So we are really in the situation what I would call between the hammer and the anvil. The hammer is the uncertainty. The anvil is that we have some imperatives. We definitely need to support business, and even more we have to support our lay people, our communities, well, our population. And this, calls for increasing at least twicely for this lay payments, land payments for unemployment on the one hand, and increasing the low wage minimum at least twice, I believe. And with this, in this connection, I would mention the paper by academician Began, just publishing the Argument and Facta today, which stresses this imperative. And I would pick this up. Uncertainty is really important. Coming back and closing my remark on this, as psychologist says, if we have this, if we don't know the reason of the risk, we don't have we don't understand the causes behind them. So this increases the uncertainty in power 3. So that makes the situation really complicated. So in this connection, I believe that from research perspective, we need to invest much more time and toil in this kind of research and trying to understand this uncertainty and to convert into these calculable risks. In this sense, we could really help to the investments, both to saving our industry and helping our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you very much. By the way, this is really a very interesting problem which Boris mentioned about the problem of spending money. You know, sometimes it seems to me that we are going back to shortage economy because money is good. We can give away a lot of money to different people, and we should do this. There is no other way as far as I see it. But in fact, the problem is what one can buy with this money, you know. And even quite big foreign reserves of the country. Also, the problem when we face this disruption in international trade, the problem is also in spending those money as well. So in a sense, you know, of course, this would be an exaggeration, but just to show the trend. We are sometimes moving to the shortage economy, where the problem is in concrete goods, not in money so much. And even what Jamie was saying about the necessity to spend as much as needed, not as much as you have. So this also means that money, seem to be quite not so important as real goods, which have to meet some demands, and at the same time, when production has collapsed, this is the major problem. You see? Yes. Mm-hmm. Boris, you wanted to say something?
No. I just completely agree, and we have this good illustration. Given this, for instance, we have money to buy this mask and medical equipment, but we can't get it. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true.
Fine. Who would like to join the discussion? I don't see all of you. Please, you can show your hand up. There is such a possibility, and then I see those who would like to say something.
Maybe I can say a few words from the
Martin,
German, Austrian perspective, so to say.
Please do. Please.
Hello, Martin.
So what happened here is that at the beginning the government took it, I think like in most countries, they took it very much as a liquidity crisis. So they set up a lot of programs to support both business but also consumers, employees, and they were actually, in Germany at least, very effective in getting the money out very quickly. So companies, smaller companies, could receive this funding within a matter of about 1 or 2 weeks. So that was quite effective. Of course, the downside with this is that you will also support a lot of companies that maybe should not have been supported in the first place. So they're like winners actually of this crisis. But okay, I think there was no other way to do it. So I think this was very good. So what happens now? We're in the discussion now of the measures being gradually eased. So there is some first reversal of shop closures taking place, for example. Also, some of the travel restrictions, at least domestically, are now being eased. So these are first tentative steps towards a recovery, and that is, of course, very, very good. And also, you see this in the public debate now that the economic considerations are becoming much more important than they were before. So until recently, all the discussion was just about flattening the curve and fighting the
looks like some conflict.
Don't speak, otherwise we cannot hear it. Yes,
okay, let me try to continue. So now the discussion is more about the economic implications. And of course, we're very much here at the beginning. So I don't think there has been a very serious assessment that says, okay, how will this affect the indebtedness of the economy? What structural changes will it bring about, and so on and so forth? This has to come now. But so far, we're really at the beginning of that process. And maybe just a few words about the European reaction also. So I think the European Central Bank has actually done quite a swift response, both in terms of extending the asset purchase program, but also very importantly, trying to ease some of the regulatory burdens for the banks. I think that's very welcome, because the second stage of the crisis is likely to be a financial crisis and a banking crisis. So this is something that we can expect already now. So this will provide some relief, which is helpful. Let's see whether it's enough. And yeah, I think I would leave you on that for the moment.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, who would like to say something with regard to those questions we discuss now? Unfortunately, Jacques has not joined us. Some unsurmountable problems with connection. It's a pity because he has prepared an interesting presentation, and he had sent me before an article he had prepared for a publication in your magazine.
Too.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yes. So it's a pity. Probably we'll give him, of course, the possibility to say some during one of the next seminars. But right now, yes, we all understand huge problems our economies face, and all governments, they are working extremely hard, and they try to do their best, but at the same time, as always in such situations, the problem is that on the one hand, one has to pay attention to acute current problems. And on the other hand, it is not possible to forget about future, because during such crisis, a lot of very significant changes can be given birth, and if you just don't see them, then you're going to be late when things are normalizing. So we all understand these general things. The problem is how practically to deal with them. Okay, I don't see raised hands. Probably some of our Chinese colleagues would like to say something, because they are now have passed the most acute part of the crisis, and they are normalizing, reinitiating economic activity very fast. And even as Mikhail Zhernov said, a lot of people believe that China is going to be, in the long run, the main winner, so to say. Not saying nothing, of course, about those problems it had faced before, and it had overcome them brilliantly. But all of us were quite interested in your experience and in your assessment of the situation. Would somebody of our Chinese colleagues would like to say a few words on this, about your experience and how you see the perspective both in your country and in the world economy? Is it a secret?
It looks like they are not involved for some reason.
Not involved.
I mean, not sure. They are just in communication with our community. Oh, Anton,
would you like to say something? Anton,
me?
No, because we saw your photo. Yes, and I believe that it was your mistake.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I pressed.
No problem.
I'd like to save some words for maybe my presentation next seminar.
Sure.
But for now, maybe it is really important to put some questions on the table, because there are so many things we don't know now. For example, there are many discussions now on the trajectory of this crisis and how will we come out of this. We will certainly come out of this situation. Some say in a few months, in most optimistic cases, some say in a year and a half, some people say it's for 2 or 3 years. And it really depends on where these people work. For example, the president of our biggest bank, Sberbank, had an interview today, and he said that everyone understands that this crisis will be long. We are not talking about a quick exit. We are talking about 2 years, maybe more. And people in touristic industry, they say, no, we are out of business at all in all. We are not going to reopen. People will not use our services for a long time. But other production loops, production chains, are quite happy with what's happening. They can raise prices because the variety of things people can spend money now has greatly decreased. There are much less things we can spend money now. So for these things, for these vital things, prices will certainly go up, and they will go up not like we cannot account for usual inflation now. But for example, we can look at the total demand of the money that has saved in savings or still earned in the public sector or otherwise. And when we take this total demand, we see much less variety of goods and services this money will be spent on. So what will be the inflation for these goods? Oh, Jacques, I see you. Okay. Towards, and maybe Jacques could continue.
No, we see Jacques, but we don't hear him yet.
Oh, he tries to. Let's keep our fingers for him. Jacques, can we hear you? Please, Jacques. Okay, Jacques.
Yes.
Oh, you're with us. Great.
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, Jacques. Sorry, Anton. Okay, Jacques.
Yes.
You are welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am absolutely sorry.
We try our best, it is, like at concerts. When
yes, exactly.
Fine artists, they
exactly.
And then he comes, star.
Well,
please.
Because this is the place where I have the best connection. But as you could understand, it was not good enough at first. So let me, if I could, at least relaunch the document. Well. Let me try to share with you this document. Okay, so are you seeing it?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
We do.
So I'm now to skip it quite fast. The main idea was to try to understand how the lockdown induced economic contraction could be a prelude to a major depression. So first, where are we? The COVID-19 pandemic is an absolutely new event. Second, the lockdown of major economies is without precedent. Third, economic consequences are certainly to be extremely important. And fourth, exit from the lockdown situation used to be difficult and very sensitive to government policy. Then we are first to examine some of world estimates done first by the OECD on March 2nd, and then quite serious estimates done by the Italian bank Unicredit on April 2nd.
Sorry, Jacques. Dear friend, please, switch off the sound because some foreign sound is here.
Okay. Well. Is that okay?
It's better. Yes, Jacques, please.
Okay. Okay. So, as you could see, the OECD was first estimating the difference between what they forecast at the beginning of the year and the forecast under the COVID-19 pandemic as just a minus 0.5% induced by the pandemic. This was, of course, much too low. If we are now looking at the Unicredit estimates, they're estimating the drop in the world GDP to minus 6% in 2020. And after that, in 2021, we will have
of your sound because it's difficult to listen to the sound. Please switch off that.
Александр Дмитриевич, звук идет от Владимира Скалкина. Вы можете принудительно ему выключить? У вас, как у организатора, есть такая возможность.
Конечно. Jacques, you are welcome to continue. Yes, please.
Okay. So I am to resume.
Yes, please.
To resume it. Okay. And as you can see, estimates for the Eurozone are particularly bleak, with a contraction going from minus 10% for Germany to minus 15 for Italy and Spain, with France caught in the middle with nearly 14. What is quite interesting also is to see that United Kingdom is given at minus 10, and now we know from the Bank of England that they are estimating the contraction at minus 13. So on this point, the Unicredit estimates are probably too optimistic on United Kingdom, and then we have minus 4 for Russia. So then, looking at the situation in France, we had estimates very early, but they were at first quite optimistic. With first the INSEE and the Banque de France, the French central bank estimates, and then the OFCE estimate. After that, we'll see the so-called estimates made in my own research center, and then the process of the French government catching up with reality. INSEE, INSEE is a French Goscomstat, and the Banque de France made the estimates about on the very basis of the productive sector disaggregation of the GDP. You can see them, and you are seeing that the loss of output under the lockdown condition was estimated as minus 35%. There is still a very serious problem because the decrease in production was mostly supply driven, with still a component demand driven. And as I said, the global decrease is to be around 35% of the normal level for the 2 months of containment. The FCE estimates are made on a different methodology where production contraction is much more demand driven. Significantly, they gave a better result than INSEE. To these estimates, we have to add the chief economist, well, not exactly, the chief of the forecasting department, Eric Heyer. He made its own estimates on the basis of electricity consumption in France and the sharp decrease of electricity consumption. It was quite an interesting estimate, but still giving something like minus 35% of contraction under the lockdown. As a result, we have these figures for the 2 months lockdown, because we know that we are supposed to exit from containment on May 11th. The loss of production on a yearly basis will be 60% for the INSEE and Banque de France. Will be probably between 5.5% for the OFC, and for UniCredit was to be 9.2%. Now, if I am to go back on semi-estimates, we agree with the INSEE methodology. So we also used the disaggregation of French GDP by productive sector. However, we think that the INSEE had underestimated the global shock. The underestimation was first of the partial unemployment, which is now at more than 44% of the French labor force, and 44% of unemployed. That means that the contraction is certainly greater than the 35% predicted by the INSEE. Then in INSEE estimates, we have no estimation, or more precisely, an underestimation of productivity losses induced by the COVID-19 situation. As a matter of fact, it is true that in a number of service sector, telework has replaced work on the place, but we also know that teleworks is inducing some kind of productivity loss for the 2 months. So we think that there is an obvious need to also introduce losses for the exit time, because as far as we understand the project of the government, by May 11th, there will be no return to normal in France. The return to normal, and precisely in the production sector, will be very, very progressive. So we think also that we have to add the losses in the transitory period beginning by May 11th and going maybe till July or August to the cost of the lockdown period. As a result, you could see here, first, estimates made by the INSEE and the Banque de France, and then estimates made by the SEMI for the agriculture and food processing industry. We're making more serious estimates of the contraction for the industry without food processing, and of course for, well, we agree with INSEE on the on construction, but we disagree sharply on services and on non-market services. As a result, we are ending with a minus 48% contraction of activity, which is more or less in line with the level of partial unemployment now recorded in France, which is, as I recall you, more than 44%. If we are translating this data on yearly GDP economic contraction, our estimates are going from minus 10.3% to minus 9.7%. The so-called Ascension 2 of the SEMI, done on March 24th, was the fact that contraction of the economy did not begin by March 15th, when the lockdown began, but began very progressively too. So this is why the Ascension 2 is giving a slightly better result than Assumption 1. Then fiscal consequences, and this is quite important. If we are translating INSEE with losses induced in the transition period from lockdown to a complete normal recovery of activity, to data from SEMI Assumption 1 and SEMI Assumption 2. And if we are translating that onto the global deficit, including, of course, the deficit which was planned in the budget law voted by the end of 2019, we are going from 285 global deficit for INSEE up to nearly 314 billion euros for the SEMI 1 assumption, which is giving a total budget deficit for the year, of course, between 12 and 14%. This is quite important because if we are looking the press, we're seeing that the current estimates made by the government were catching up with the reality, but are still now a bit too rosy if we compare them to estimates. Bruno Le Maire, the French Minister of Economy, first predicted an economic contraction of minus 1.7% by March 15, and then he went to minus 8% in April 13. Gérald Darmanin, who is the French Minister of Budget, began by an estimation of deficit of minus 3.9% in March 15, which was obviously very far from the actual reality, and went to an estimation of at least minus 9% in April 15th. And we are thinking with colleagues that this minus 19% is still underestimating the amount of shock. Now, how to exit from the lockdown situation? First, we have the problem of supply and demand in the post-lockdown economy. The psychological aspect, framing effect, endowment effect, induced by the pandemic ought to weigh heavily onto the microeconomic demand by people. By the way, also we have the international demand for French exports, which ought to be severely affected by the pandemic. And if we are looking onto the external dimension of the supply shock, then it is very clear that supply chain and the nature of demand is to change. To what extent, it's quite difficult still to estimate, but this change will be quite important. Let us just look at the tourism sector, which is quite important in France. In France, every year, we are receiving between 85 and 89 million of foreign tourists. There will be probably between 12 and 15 million before the pandemic. But after that, no more foreign tourists, because all the displacements have been frozen. And this will probably stay with us till the end of the year. So the shock on this specific sector of the French economy is to be very important. A second problem is the possible massive change in relative price. This has been raised to my mind by a possible analogy with the post-World War I situation. In the post-World War I situation, economy of Western powers, the French, United Kingdom, United States, first went up from the end of 1918 to 1919, and after that, we all knew quite an important contraction of production, because relative price have considerably changed during the wartime, and the fact that some restriction imposed by war has been lifted, and that also created some change in relative price. The second unknown problem is, as I have said, how will the supply chain disruption affect economy. My personal opinion is that this problem is to be quite serious. But so far, we have no clear indication on how long this disruption will stay with us, even after the end of the lockdown. And then it is quite possible that we will see by the end of the lockdown situation, a combination between Keynesian and Schumpeterian unemployment. Keynesian unemployment being created by a lack of demand, and Schumpeterian unemployment will be created by the change in relative price. Third point, the European austerity framework. It was well known that the EU was very late to respond to the emergency. As a matter of fact, the Italian government asked the EU for a specific response by February 18. And the first serious answer was given by the EU, the so-called Brussels Commission, only by March 21st. More than 1 month of delay. Second point, the Corona bonds issue. You probably know that the French and the Italian government have been very involved in the process of trying to create some European Corona bonds. And this project has been absolutely blocked by Germany, but not just by Germany. It will be unfair to put all the blame on German shoulders. Netherlands also blocked, and also Finland. Then the weakness of budget support. So far, if we are adding up all the dimension of the possible help given by the European Union, including the European Stability Mechanism, we are ending up with an amount of 550 billion against an estimated need between 1,150 and 1,300 billions, which are to be needed by the end of the year. So the difference between what has been planned by the EU and what is needed by different countries is absolutely enormous. Then let me just talk about the Pandemic Emergency Purchasing Program, the PEPP, from the European Central Bank, which is quite an important program, but which is now, well, more or less described as a 1 trillion euros program of purchasing by the European Central Bank of sovereign bonds issued by different governments. When, by comparison, the United States, which have a more or less similar and even a smaller economy than the EU, well, the Federal Reserve is planning a 2 trillion, more than 2 trillion US dollar purchasing program. And the point 4 is probably a kind of return to economic sovereignty. It's an issue which has become quite important in some countries, not just in France. In Italy and Spain, there is a lot of talk about the return to a kind of economic sovereignty. I have to add that in his last speech, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, made a pledge to support and to reinforce French economic sovereignty. It is at the end of his speech, but he spoke twice of the French planning. It was the first time that he made a public reference to the planning process in France, and he, at least in words, very strongly defended economic sovereignty. But then you have the question, is national economic sovereignty compatible with EU regulation? Obviously not. So how Italian and French leaders are hoping to convince EU to soften or even to dismiss some of its foreign trade regulation, this is an absolutely unknown field. And then there is still quite a problem with both the EMU, the European Monetary Union, and the European Union. Are they really at stake? If you look at the interview given by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, to the Financial Times some days ago, you could see that he is very seriously thinking that both the EU and the Eurozone are at stake because of the pandemic. So this is, at this point, what can be said about the situation in Europe and in France.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jacques. You know, I understood that you are quite an optimist in the sense that it can be even worse than it was
Yes, yes.
forecast. So, colleagues, please, you are welcome to put questions and to make comments. So, Jacques, yes, Boris, I see. Do you want to?
Yeah.
The question.
Jack, first of all, say thank you very much for a very comprehensive and intriguing presentation, indeed. And I have a question on your slide, I believe number 5, if you can replicate it. It concerns on this perspective on this year and next year, these projections. I'm interested in these figures for the year 2021 on rebound for different countries. Would you please comment on this? And can you just replicate this slide again? Number 5, I believe.
Jacques, your sound is...
Yes.
Okay, yeah, do you hear me?
Yes. I'm also to activate the... Okay.
It looks like
it was displayed, yeah.
You're not confused. Yes, this one. Just compare, please. Well, we see this minus 10 in Germany. The next year we see plus 10, and France minus 30, and then 11. So just compare. I mean, the race or the rate of rebounding in the next year.
Yes.
Do you have some comments or can speculate on this?
Yeah. First, I have to say that the line on Russia is not done by UniCredit. It was data sent to me by Alexander Shirov.
Yes, I know.
I want to make this precision. Then, on the Eurozone, UniCredit is forecasting a very strong rebound by 2021. Mm-hmm. Personally, I don't see that quite probable for different reasons. The first reason is the fact that in 2021, the economic effect accumulated during the lockdown time and after will still weigh on the different economies. Maybe less on the German economy, but certainly on the French, Italian, and Spanish economy. Let me just give you an example. The most optimistic forecast I have seen is expecting unemployment to raise by 500,000 people in France. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying it's the most optimistic. It could be worse. We know that in Italy, more than 10% of all small and very small enterprise are to go bankrupt after the lockdown situation. So I don't have data on the Spanish economy. So we can forecast a situation where the demand will still be quite restricted in 2021, even with a massive support by the state, because still think all the program helping the economy will still be in place. Nevertheless, with this amount of unemployment in France, Italy, and probably in Spain, you know that in Spain, I have seen, yes, one data. Now the unemployment is at around 15% of the workforce. Mm-hmm. And the forecast is that by the end of 2020, it will have jumped to 20%, more than 1/3. So it will go back to the level of unemployment during the 2012 crisis, the so-called debt crisis in the Eurozone. So I don't think that we will have this amount of rebound that the UniCredit is forecasting. The important result is that if you look at the fourth row, 2021 by comparison to 2019, even with this very optimistic forecast, the Italian and Spanish GDP ought to be much lower in 2021 than they were in 2019. The French will be also lower. So I think that the destruction of wealth induced by the pandemic and by the lockdown, by the containment of economy, is to be extremely important. And the recovery is to be pretty long and will, at best, if governments are not missing things, and you know my position about European governments and their propensity to frequently mess all the process in which they are involved. Nevertheless, even if they are doing well on every count, I think that we are not to return to the 2019 level of GDP before 2023 or 24th.
Thank you, Jacques.
Thank you. Please, colleagues, who would like? Oh, yes, Anton. Yes? Please do.
Thank you. Jacques, you had a number of 44% of increased unemployment, but I didn't quite catch what does this number mean. Do the people still gain salaries and wages, but not work as much, less by 44%? Or did their revenues fall down by 44%? What do you get from this figure and how is it built?
Okay. The so-called partial unemployment figures are given by the Ministry of Labor. They're computing all people which were previously employed before the containment, before the lockdown, and we can't work because of the lockdown, and the government decided to put them onto partial unemployment to ensure that they will have at least a part of their salaries. Under the French law, when you are going onto partial unemployment or technical unemployment, it's also a word which is fairly used. You are still earning 84% of your normal wages. And this is paid by the unemployment benefit system, the ACEDIC, and of course by the state, because the amount of spending will massively exceed what the ACEDIC could pay in normal time. What is interesting is the fact that at first, the Ministry of Labor said, well, we will have between 2 million, 3 million of people under the system. 1 week ago, they told us 8 million of people. So they moved from 2 or 3 million to 8 million of people. Today, there is a new speech which has been given by the Ministry of Labor, saying no, not 8, 9.6 million of people, which means 1 on 2 people employed by the private sector in France is now on partial unemployment. And of course, this is not counting entrepreneurs, people self-employed, all that is not included in this total. So this is giving you the amount of disruption in the French economy. So you can understand why I'm thinking that the minus 35% given by the INSEE and Banque de France 3 weeks ago are very out of the mark. We are more certainly closer to 50% than to 35%.
That's the productivity shock, not the demand
shock,
shock, but the
without
productivity.
Because if you look now, well, if we assume that 1/2 of the private employed labor force is not employed anymore. So we have the other half which is still employed. But can we assume that people which are still employed are employed with the same productivity than before the lockdown? Obviously not. Obviously not. You just have to talk with entrepreneurs which have people working on telework, working from their own home, and they say, well, yes, of course, these people can do things, but they are not doing the same thing if they were working in the office. So we have a global loss of productivity that I can compute for now, but that I am estimating to at least 20 to 30%.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please, Jacques, what's your opinion about the role of building up of debts during this crisis, inflicted both by demand side and supply side shocks? And if it is as serious as some people mentioned before, saying about other countries, what exit from this debt crisis do you envisage? Will it result in new nationalizations or some financial measures clearing those debts within the economy? What's your opinion on that?
First, what his plan? What his plan is, of course, a partial nationalization of some large enterprise like Air France, where the government is to buy stakes just to prevent the company to go bankrupt. After that, so far, the French government has decided to postpone, not to cancel, to postpone most of taxes and debts which are due by private enterprise. And there is a strong movement in the French economy, mostly from small and medium enterprise, but also from some large enterprise, calling a complete cancellation of at least 3 months of taxes and state charges on enterprise. So far, the government has been extremely touchy on this issue, but I think that there is no other solution than to cancel at least, if not 3 months, at least 2 months of these payments. Then you have the problem of debt owed to banks. And the government asked the French banks to refund enterprise. French banks said, okay, we have no problem with that, but they did that at the previous interest rates, not at subsidized interest rates done by the government to banks. So now there is a looming conflict between the French government and French banks on these interest rates. The French government is saying, well, we are giving you some money to help you to make new credits, but you are making these credits at the old interest rates. It's unfair. Yes, of course, it's unfair. How they would solve this situation is something still to be seen. Last problem, the public indebtednent. At the end of 2019, the French public debt was around 102% of GDP. By the end of 2020, the French debt will probably be at 120%. Maybe it will be at 118%, maybe at 22%, but that will be more or less the range of estimates. What is to be done? Are we to raise massively taxes to try to pay this debt? If the government is doing that, this is the certain guarantee that the French economy will be in recession for the next 4 or 5 years. Could we cancel this debt? That seems difficult because of the YEMU, because of the European Central Bank. So the only solution to reduce this level, this burden of debt is, of course, inflation. If we could have a 4% or 5% inflation rate for the next 3 to 4 years, this will mechanically reduce the burden of debt. But here again, to have this level of inflation would induce a massive change in the European Central Bank policy. This is not impossible. I am not saying that it is absolutely impossible. Still, it will be very, very difficult when you know the complete fascination of Germany and Netherlands on price stability.
And how then would it be possible?
One possibility is, of course, well, you know that printing money is not the real world because we are no more printing money, but by granting more and more credits, by increasing massively the monetary mass by comparison to the economy. After that,
how can you do this being part of the Eurozone? Jacques, I don't hear you.
Sorry. On this point, Mrs. Christine Lagarde is quite ready to do that. Actually, the PEPP, which is already planning to 1 trillion euros for this year, could be extended for the next year, could be increased, going maybe to 2 trillion, 3 trillions, things like that. So technically, it is possible. The problem is that Germany is first very strongly against any increase in the PEPP. Germany and also Netherlands has made what they called to reduce the level of the PEPP. And the second problem is also that the PPP could come under a legal attack by people from Germany because, well, there is quite a technical snag. In 2018, some German bankers asked to the European Court of Justice if the program of purchasing sovereign bonds made by the ECB was legal, of course, compared to the ECB charter. And what the European Court of Justice said was that, yes, it's legal because, and that's important, because the ECB is limiting to 30% of the debt of each state what it is buying. But with the PEPP, the previous ceiling of 30% has went over. So it is not impossible, and this is an understatement, it is not impossible that the same people ought to ask the European Court of Justice, now that the ECB has lifted its ceiling, is it legal or not? And then the Court of Justice will be in a very difficult position. Because as it said 2 years ago that it was legal because of this ceiling, now that there is no ceiling anymore, what they could say? And so there is a serious problem here.
Thank you, Jacques. Please, colleagues who would like to ask questions or make a comment?
Could I ask a question?
Yes, please, Viktor Meirovich Polterovich, please.
Hi, Jacques. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a very simple question. Do you think that European Union survive or not? I hope that the answer is yes, but what is your opinion?
Jacques, please switch on.
Sorry.
The sound, yes.
Yeah. You know that I'm not strongly favoring or strongly supporting the European Union. What is to be said is that I don't think that the European Union could survive without modifying very seriously its own rule. That is quite certain. The Italian Prime Minister, Mr. Giuseppe Conte, has already said that without some massive change in EU regulation, the EU could be dead by the next 2 years. What the French president said in the Financial Times is more or less the same thing. So we will have to very closely watch the debate between countries like France, Italy, Spain, and on the other side, Germany, Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, also Slovakia, about are we to change the rules or not. My own opinion is that without massive change, there is no possibility to make the EU to survive to this shock. So either people which are deeply involved into this European process will understand that And we'll understand that when you have a choice between the principles and the rules, it's always more important to save the principles and not to save the rules, or there are to stick with the current rules. And then, you know, maybe by next year, Italy could do the same thing that what Great Britain has done with the Brexit. And you have to understand that if Italy is leaving the EU, France could not stay anymore in the EU, because we have two so close economies and so much competing between themselves economy that we can afford to be restricted by EU rules if Italian economy is no more constricted by this rule. So I think that it will be extremely important to look at the Italian reaction on this point.
Thank you, Jacques. And what kind of changes do you mean? What
exactly?
The European Union, would they mean some drawback in integration process, or just a new line, a new direction of this integration? What do you expect?
I think that at the very minimum, some regulation, mainly regulation which are linked to foreign trade, are to be changed. There is a need for a new kind of protectionism, at least at the EU level. If these things were to be done, yes, it's quite possible that the EU will survive. If not, I think that the accumulation of problems inside the EU ought to become unmanageable.
Could you explain what do you mean by new kind of protectionism?
Well, you know that at the very beginning, when it was no more, not still the EU, but the common market, the idea was, okay, inside the common market, we are to reduce significantly all the tariffs and all the trade barrier, but we are to keep a very strong barrier and very strong tariffs outside of the common market. And from the 1990s to now, we began to dismantle all these protection. And this is a point which is now very strongly contested by people in Italy, in Spain, in France. So is the EU able to say, okay, we have to go back to the previous situation, to the situation of the common market, and to reintroduce some kind of protection at the border of the EU or not? This is a thing which is to be seen in the months to come. But I think that the importance of debate inside the EU between the southern countries and the northern countries is to become extremely important in the next weeks and the next month.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Boris, you have your hand up. Porfirio, Boris.
No. I'm fine. No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
May I ask a question,
Sure.
please? It's Vladimir Skalkin.
Yes, Vladimir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jacques, thank you very much for marvelous presentation. We enjoyed it, and I loved it so much. And I have a question with regard to geopolitical implications of current crisis. And some news report that the United States has launched investigation into the cause of coronavirus pandemic, and some observers may suggest that as a result of this investigation, there will be following accusations, and the United States may default on the debt they owe to China. With the regard of falling demand in Europe, based on what you have said in your presentation, with the regard of falling demand in the world, and the mainly export orientation of China, plus some possible default on the debt, will the role of China as global factory, as it's called now, influence global balance of supply and demand in global economy and partly in the European economy? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite obvious that in the coming years, we are going to a much more fragmented world than the one where we are living. Even the French president has acknowledged the fact. It is not to say that all the countries or all the geographic zones are to go back to a kind of autarky, but that I think that international trade is to decrease, at least to decrease in percentage. And as a matter of fact, it could be seen already since 2013, 2014. The process of decreasing of foreign trade by comparison to world GDP had already begun. I think that this trend is to accelerate. And there will be probably no more any big world power, first the United States, and they could not have this position anymore. But I don't think that China wants really to be the United States of the 21st century. I think that China will be very happy if it is to secure a kind of protective zone in Asia and to have some kind of trade with other economic regions. But as a matter of fact, already the Chinese economy is recentering itself onto the internal market and much less the external market. You know, as a matter of fact, China is not the country with the greatest foreign trade surplus. It's Germany, not China. And the level of production of Germany is much less than China. So I think that this global fragmentation, this deglobalization of the world is to hit very severely Germany much more than China.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, would somebody like to put a question or to make a comment, or we should come to an end? Please do if you want. Okay, then. After all, we had a very interesting presentation by Jacques today. Thank you so much, Jacques. And we had a marvelous discussion, questions, answers, and all that. Very many important and very accurate problems have been forward, though we don't know answers to all of them, but putting right questions by itself is very important. I think that we are moving in the right direction.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. And we are going to have our next seminar in a week time on Tuesday at 6:00 p.m. Moscow time. And our speakers will be Alexei Kireev from IMF, and he's also, as I've already mentioned, our visiting professor, and Anton Moiseev. We had a chance of seeing him today, asking questions and making comments and participating in discussion. I also have a preliminary agreement with such well-known researchers as Sergei Rogov. For many years, he used to be director of the Institute for USA and Canada, and now he's the scientific leader of that institute. Also with Mikhail Golovnin, first deputy director of the Institute of Economics and also professor of Moscow School of Economics, with Boris Porfiryev and Alexander Shirov also. So we have, I believe, very interesting. Probably I forgot somebody, I'm sorry, but I have a list written down, so don't be nervous if I missed you, please. So we have very interesting seminars ahead, and please, those of you who would like to be one of the speakers, please make an application to and send it to Ekaterina Zavarzina, and we'll try to satisfy all your requests. Thank you very much. Goodbye. We'll see you next Tuesday. Bye. Thank you, Jacques. It was brilliant.
Thank you, Jacques. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacques. Very good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bonsoir.